David was a champion before he ever won this battle. And the reason is because he was willing to stand up between the two armies as a representation for Israel. He was willing to stand up for everybody else instead of everyone else because no one else would do it. This is what made him a champion. He was the only one willing to stand up on behalf of God and his people. And judging from his looks, as we said before, Saul should have been the one, but they weren't willing to take the risk with him. You would think that Abner, the commander of the army, would have been the next likely candidate, but he didn't have the courage either. Then you would think any old soldier would be more qualified than a shepherd, right? So, they should have done it, but none of them were willing. And then after David volunteered, you'd think that his older three brothers would have said, no, don't, either not to be shown up by their little brother or to protect their little brother. They would have been like, no, I'll do it. But they didn't do it either. And so none of the likely candidates had the courage or the faith to fight the giant, but they also didn't seem offended enough to defend God. And David did. And so David wasn't the most qualified. He didn't appear to be the most likely to succeed. He wasn't their leader. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't the oldest of all his father's sons. And yet he was the only one that was offended by this Philistine and what he was saying about God and God's people. And he was the only one with the courage and the faith to act on his offense. And so why is that? Why is David the only one that is willing to be a champion for God and his people? Why is this musician more offended about what the Philistines are saying than the king of Israel? Why is he willing to step forward before the leader of the army? How is it that a shepherd can have more courage than a soldier? And why is the youngest brother willing to do things that the older brothers are not? Basically, what I'm asking is, why is it that David had enough faith to do this and no one else did? Well, one reason that we know about is because he had the Spirit of God with him, right? As soon as God rejected Saul and selected David, then the Spirit of God left Saul and went to David. And it says that the Spirit of God remained with David for the rest of his life. And so God was with David. So God gave him that courage, right? We know that. We know that God was with him, and with God's Spirit comes God's power. And so God gave him the power, the courage to do this. But also, David knew that he had been anointed for some purpose. We don't know if he knew that he had been anointed to be the king or that he had just been anointed to do something for God in the future. If Samuel told him that he was going to be the king, then presumably David was trusting that he would live that God would protect him in this battle, because he would have to protect him in order for him to fulfill the purpose that God had for him, that he had anointed him for in the first place, of being the king. If he didn't know that that he was being anointed to be the king, maybe he thought that this was what he was being anointed to do, that this was his calling, or that God had some future calling for him that he doesn't know, but it would be the same thing as if it were to be the king, that God would have to protect his life in order for him to fulfill whatever that future purpose may be. And so he was also trusting in his calling. He had the Spirit of God, and so God had given him courage, but he also had the calling of God on his life, and he was trusting in that calling, knowing that God would protect him so that he could fulfill that call. But also, as a shepherd, he had a lot of alone time, right? And so we find out later on that David wrote many of the Psalms in the Bible, which are just songs to God. And we also know that he has been playing the harp for a long time, because he is going back and forth playing the harp for Saul. And so presumably he didn't start writing songs after he became king. He had been doing this all along, playing music and writing songs, presumably to God, because this is what we know he did when he was the king and he wrote all of the Psalms. And so he is out there in the fields in this time alone, spending much of it with God, we can assume. writing songs and singing them to God. So he is out there in the fields worshiping and praising God and praying to God. Many of the Psalms that we later read are prayers to God. And so you have to assume that he has a very close and personal relationship with God. And when you have a close personal relationship with someone, you're offended when someone talks against them, right? And you want to defend them. And so this is why David was more offended than everyone else, because he had a better relationship with the person that this Philistine was speaking against. And he cares about God, he cares about God's people, and he doesn't like how this guy's talking. And then David also knew something that the rest of the people didn't, that physical power doesn't matter, qualifications and skills don't matter, experience and age don't matter. All that really matters is whether God is for you or against you. That's really the thing that matters the most. And when this Philistine had picked a fight with God's people, he had picked a fight with God. And so David was going to fight for God and God's people, and he was trusting that God would fight for him because he was fighting for him. But then how did he still have the courage to defend God? Yes, he had the power of God with him, and with that brings courage, but also God had already revealed to him the things that he can do. And that's what David told Saul whenever Saul said, you can't do this. He said, I know I can, because God's helped me defeat the lions and the bears. And if he can do that, then he can do this. I know that. He was relying on his past experiences with God to tell him what God could do for him in the future. He's like, if God can protect me from the lions and bears, he can protect me from this Philistine. And if he can give me the ability to protect my father's sheep from them, then he can give me the ability to protect my heavenly father's people from this Philistine. The predator that comes against God's people, he can protect me against, just as he protected me from the predator that came against my father's sheep. And so he's relying on his past experiences with God to let him know what God can do. And that gives him courage and faith in the Lord. And so that brings us to the last question. Why did he not use the weapons, though? Why? Okay, we know why he's offended. We know how he has the courage and the faith to go and act on this offense. But why didn't he use the weapons and the armor that Saul gave him? If a shepherd is going to act like a warrior, shouldn't he have the armor and the weapons that soldiers have? Likely these are the best, equipment that Israel has. And so why wouldn't he use it? Why would he refuse those things for sticks and stones? Again, it's because David knows that he's not fighting the battle in his own power anyway. Just as he's not relying on his own stature or on his own experience or his own skill, he has no reason to rely on these traditional weapons either. And he has the protective armor of God, so he doesn't need the protective armor of Saul. He doesn't need Saul to equip him, because God has already given him everything he needs. God didn't call him when he was a soldier. He called him when he was a shepherd. And so David is assuming that God's already given him the skills and the abilities that he needs as a shepherd. If God had called him while he was a soldier, then he would have been familiar with those weapons and with that armor, but he didn't call him in that capacity. And he didn't need any armor when he was fighting off the bears and the lions, because God was his protection then. And so he's like, no, I'm not going to use these, this armor that I don't need, and I'm not going to use these weapons that I'm not used to. I'm familiar with the sling, and I know how to use it, and so I'm going to do that. And, we see how that paid off, right? Because he wasn't weighed down by all of this heavy armor, and he also wasn't weighed down by fear, because he had the armor of God. And so he could rush at Goliath and maneuver way better than Goliath could because of that. Also, Since he was so familiar with the sling, he could run and sling it all in one smooth motion with all of this power and kill him. And he probably couldn't have done any of that if he would have had, a sword or a javelin. He's not used those weapons before. And so we can see that David was smart in just relying on the fact that God had already equipped him in every way that he needed to, that God would protect him just as he always had, and that he just needed to rely on God's power, God's protection, and the skills that God had already given him. And we see that that worked. And then because he came in God's name and in God's power, trusting in the person that God had created him to be, he was victorious. And everybody knew that it was God's power and not David's. This is pretty obvious, right? He doesn't come looking like this mighty warrior. And so everybody's like, yeah, the only way that David could win this is if God had done it for him. And so the fight was for God. David was fighting for him. And the victory was because of him. This whole thing is about God. It's not about David.